Greetings. I thought this might be an apt time, given the fairly recent Oregon mass shooting, to give my views on guns. I had promised to give a full exposition of my views on guns and gun control anyway, so it kind of falls into place right now. Now, you'll find, at least in my view, that my views conform to neither the conservative side of the issue nor the progressive liberal side of the issue. And more specifically, like every other political issue, I am not an ism, but I align my particular view on a particular issue based on context. And I think a lot of people who do not understand multiple countries or have not lived in multiple countries have a very myopic view of this. If you've only lived in the United States, you have a certain view. If you only lived in Europe, you have a certain view, and so on and so forth. I think I'm fortunate to have various accounts of living in different places that have helped inform my view on this. Let me say at the outset, in the context of the United States, I support the quote-unquote right to bear arms or possessing guns. But it's not that simple. Now, one thing we need to get out of the way very early on is that it is a pipe dream, a liberal, progressive pipe dream, to think, even if this were desirable, and it might be had the United States evolved in a completely different context and atmosphere, to get rid of the guns. At this current moment in time, and the most recent stats I have are from 2012, and everything I'm talking about stats-wise and otherwise, there'll be many links. You can look in the low bar at them if you're interested, has about 112 firearms per 100 residents. Of course, as you well know, that's more than any other developed country in the entire world. This is pretty well known. So right now, probably somewhere between 350 and 400 million firearms in circulation legally in the United States, not talking about contraband and black market firearms, and I'm sure there are plenty of those too. We don't have the numbers on that. It is a pipe dream to think we can get, in the context of the United States, get rid of guns or impose really strict regulations on them for a number of reasons. One, the sheer presence of guns. They're everywhere in the United States. That's number one. Number two, the United States has a very different history to European countries or South Korea or wherever. The United States has a unique, for better or worse, cultural and historical context that is missing elsewhere. United States, quote-unquote, patriots, revolutionaries, fought a war against the British Empire in order to gain freedom. And since that time, certain concepts and ideas have sort of been enshrined in the American mentality. More importantly, according to Steven Pinker, and these are his thoughts on this, as you know, public intellectual, author, psychologist from Harvard, who wrote the book The Better Angels of Our Nature, he's rather convinced that due to large geographical areas without communication with each other, a sort of Wild West attitude had long been present in the American mentality, and it's still there. If you look at the United States, it's very spread out. There are urban centers, but many of the Midwest or North Midwest states are pretty empty. And in this context, you had a certain level of lawlessness and the instinct, if you will, to protect oneself against that lawlessness. There are factors at play in the United States that people do not take into account. I've seen a few people take into account, particularly those of left-leaning liberal mindset, which is to say, gun regulations and gun restrictions that work in other countries are almost certainly not going to be applicable to the United States for the two, broadly speaking, reasons I cited. One, the number of guns in circulation in the United States, and the unique history of the United States, as well as the geography. And you can see this. Rural gun ownership is much higher than urban gun ownership. This is not just due to, I believe, restrictions, although urban gun restrictions tend to be greater, but simply for the fact that if you're living in the wilds of Wyoming or Minnesota, you're not going to necessarily have police or authorities near you that can take care of problems, and so you have to protect yourself. This seems to make sense. The more rural you go, the higher the rates of gun ownership. And this is another thing that needs to be mentioned at the beginning of this video. The United States is a country divided. The urban American experience is very different from the rural one. I say this without a shred of arrogance. I'm not fond of New York. I'm not against New York, but New York has nothing, for example, in common with the rest of the United States. Maybe vaguely with some other large cities, but certainly nothing in common with, say, rural Kansas or rural Minnesota, North Dakota. They're essentially different countries unto themselves. And the idea that you could universally apply certain rules or restrictions to one place that is completely different in mindset and mentality and history someplace else is absurd. So let me say that liberals or left-leaning people who don't give this much thought are living in a dream world. It's a pipe dream to think you could either confiscate guns or impose very strict regulation, particularly in rural areas. Another thing, we do have lunatics on the right. I call them lunatics. That they would literally fight a civil war and kill tens of thousands of people just because they believe the right to bear arms is a kind of a holy writ or a holy right given by God. I'm certainly not on that side. But in the context of the United States, it's just not going to change ever, I think. And I could just say that's the video, because that is my view. In the United States, there are too many arms on the ground. People are too fanatical about their belief in the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. And there is a vast cultural and historical divide between the urban and the rural. And so there's not much you can do about that. Mass shootings, incidentally, are not that common, although the United States has a pretty large share of them. They're rare. But of course, sensationalist news tends to put them at the forefront and everyone gets wind of this. Now, I didn't know this until I started researching this, but interestingly, in the context of the United States, the highest cause of gun-related death is not mass shootings, not gang violence, but suicide. And whereas most interpersonal gun violence takes place in an urban environment, these suicides take place in a rural environment. And you can make an argument based on the evidence that limiting access to guns and I'm going to talk about a little more about this, to mentally ill people or people suffering from depression could be helpful. Gun suicide attempts, or follow-throughs is a better way of putting it, have 95% plus success rates versus other things such as cutting or poisoning or hangings. They're much more successful. So you could make an argument to say, well, if we had, in some dream world, which will never come to pass, if you were to get rid of guns, then suicide rates would go down just because they wouldn't be as successful. And I think there's evidence to suggest that. Once again, that's not going to happen. So what's to be done? I do think one regulation or restriction should be applied, and I think I call this psychological means testing. People who are mentally ill and mentally unstable probably shouldn't be people to wield firearms. This, to me, seems like a no-brainer. But people might disagree with this. That said, given the proliferation of firearms in the United States, I hate to say it, the religious fanaticism and belief in gun ownership in the United States, your best bet in the United States to remain safe probably is to own a gun, because there's either going to be some crazy or lunatic around the corner with a gun threatening you, and to equalize yourself against him, you're going to probably need a gun yourself. Likewise, in far-off, rural, far-flung areas, you have no recourse to police or other authorities, and so you're probably going to be in the best hands if you own a firearm and know how to use a firearm. The United States is a very unique case. Now, the other interesting thing is that the United States, in terms of petty crime or sort of nonviolent crime, has comparable rates to other countries in the world. Things like burglary, pickpocketing, normal robbings. But in terms of the lethality, the United States beats other industrialized nations. I'm not counting Russia here. People like to bring Russia up, but I don't consider that entirely industrialized. And this is almost certainly due to the presence of guns. These could, in theory, all be arguments against mass gun ownership, but it doesn't matter. Once again, it is a liberal pipe dream to believe you can get guns off the ground and dispossess people of their guns. People in the United States, particularly people in rural areas outside of the Northeast or large cities such as Chicago, are obsessed with guns to a degree that most people don't understand. I don't understand it. I don't understand the desire. I certainly understand historically and contextually where it comes from, but there you have it. So there's not really much you could do. However, the problem with these mass shootings you see is people point out, and I agree with this, that if someone had a gun, the shooting could have been stopped. So it's kind of like fighting fire with fire here. The United States has much higher levels of lethal violence than other industrialized countries, and frankly speaking, that's something that Americans will have to live with. And if that's the case, you need to fight fire with fire. If I were living in the United States, I would probably learn how to use a firearm, a handgun. I probably would train with it. I don't want to. I have absolutely no interest in guns, and I'm very happy I don't live in the United States. Now let's move over to other countries. In the 1980s, there were some gun-related incidents, say in Australia. The government cracked down, and really violence, overall violence, and certainly gun violence has dropped significantly since that in the context of Australia. Now, it's true that Australia was founded, at least in part, as a penal colony for convicts, hence my joke about the penal colony, but this is specific to Australia. Likewise, impositions in the UK, and, on the continent, of course, Switzerland, you're required by law to own a gun. That's, once again, Switzerland has its own unique history. And then there's Germany, which kind of has a middle-range gun ownership, although nowhere near the United States. But the main thrust of my argument here is that people outside the United States just are not as obsessed with guns as Americans are. The Americans, who aren't required by law to own guns, as the Swiss, have more guns per head than the Swiss do. It's quite extraordinary. I do not want to live in a society, personally, where everyone is running around with a gun and thinks it's some sort of God-given right. It's one of, not the only reason, but one of the reasons I don't live in the United States. So my advice to people who don't like that is to expatriate, leave. You're never going to change this. And I'm not being a pessimist. I'm talking about reality here. Let's also talk about the problems of prohibition. We saw this with regards to alcohol in the 1920s. It's almost certain that there's an illegal firearms trade going on, a black market. Imagine how much bigger that black market would be after banning guns or imposing draconian gun control laws or measures. Not going to happen. You would get even more violence. The gun fanatics would probably let loose a civil war. And we already have gun problems with gun restrictions. If you look at urban areas, if you look at Chirac, which is the unfortunate recent name of Chicago, which has in recent years picked up the highest murder-homicide rate in the United States, their gun regulations and restrictions, and people are still shooting each other. People don't like to talk about it, but most gun violence, non-self-inflicted, non-suicidal, and once again, suicide accounts for roughly 60%, a little over 60% of gun-related deaths in the United States, is black-on-black violence in the inner cities. These arms are usually not purchased legally; they're gotten illicitly, and these things go on anyway. And black city youths are killing each other. And we can go into the history as to why that's happening with the welfare state and all that, but we've been over that. This is just what I'm saying right now. Imposing gun regulations has not changed anything in that context. I think things are really context heavy. And this is the overall thrust of my argument. In Australia, for example, restricting guns seems to have worked relatively well. Same thing in the UK. And then you have other places where, like Germany, which you don't sort of middle of the road, where people just aren't as obsessed with guns. There's a gun shop in my neighborhood. I walk by it sometimes. I also have knives. Always like knives more than guns, personally. Maybe because I'm a medieval kind of guy, but yeah, people own guns, but they're just not obsessed with it. And it's true I live in an urban area, but and I know for a fact that, yeah, certainly gun ownership rises in more rural areas. This is universal. But it's just that mentality that is so ingrained in most Americans, this obsession with firearms, is not present in most countries. And even in Switzerland, which I lived in for half a year, and I've talked to many Swiss people, Yeah, you're legally required as part of being a militia to own a firearm, but no one's obsessed with it, not to the extent the Americans are. So, what can be done? I don't think a whole lot could be done. If it were up to me, I would say impose psychological means testing to make sure people are not basically crazy. But these gun free zones aren't really helping anything. They're making things worse in a lot of ways. These mass shootings could have been prevented if someone had had a concealed weapon or what have you. And there are numerous instances of the United States of guns preventing further violence or at least saving people's lives. I see this as a fairly unique American problem, and it's for Americans to deal with. But there's never going to be any leeway because you only have, frankly speaking, religiously fanatical gun advocates on the right and left leaning, liberal, mindless fools, frankly speaking, who don't understand that it's context based. You can't apply what works, say, in Australia to the United States. They have a different history, a different population, etc. It's not going to work. So people need to come to terms with that. If you live in the United States, you better get used to guns. And it's probably in your best interest to learn how to use one and to operate one, and it might actually save your life. Once again, the United States has higher levels of lethal violence than any other industrialized country. I'm not talking about Russia here or China. Places like Australia, places like the Netherlands, places like Denmark, Ireland, and so on. If you're going to be competitive in terms of violence, you're going to need a gun too. So there's really isn't a solution here. So it's really something that liberals and left-leaning progressives need to come to terms with. People ask me, why don't I talk about this? I'm talking about it now. You're not going to be able to get rid of guns. Once again, 112, as of 2012, 112 firearms per 100 residents. What are you going to do? Confiscate the guns? You try to do that, there will be a civil war, and the gun fanatics will kill you all. So that's pretty much my view. I see guns in the context of the United States as a necessary evil, but I'm very glad the obsession with firearms and gun ownership is not present in the country I live in or any of the countries I'd like to live in. It certainly wasn't the reason I left the United States. It's just kind of a happy after effect for me that I don't live in a country like that, and I would prefer not to live in a country like that. And I grew up in a time in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s in New York City when things, crime-wise, had not been cleaned up very well. And certainly there was a fear. If I were to live, depending on where in the United States, like I said, I probably would undergo firearm training and acquire at least a handgun or something, because it might be necessary. But outside of the United States, depending on the country, I don't really see the same necessity. I think guns are, they're recreational usages, I suppose. But, it's a question of safety and security. And if a society is safe enough so as to not require the constant use of a gun and encourage gun ownership, I don't see the point in engaging in it, for me. So that's pretty much my view on the issue. There are probably, in a different world, in a different history, in a different culture, yeah, the United States could benefit from fewer guns. The suicide rate probably would go down because most gun-related deaths are suicides, of course, by males. That's not in the statistics I have, but one can assume that most of them are males. And obviously, without guns, it's a lot harder to pull off mass shootings. But, you just got to deal with it. My recommendation is find a country that interests you and try to expatriate there. And that's it. America, United States as a country belongs to the gun owners primarily. And I don't see that changing anytime soon, or ever for that matter. There would be a kind of civil war if people actually try to change that in great numbers, and that would cause even more bloodshed. So it's not really going to happen, and it's something you need to accept. Guns and lethal violence are more prevalent in the United States than other industrialized countries, and that's something you just got to accept. I'm not saying you should celebrate it, but the United States just has more gun-related lethal violence. Now, deal with it or leave. And if you're going to deal with it, you probably should get a gun. But if you don't, then leave. I didn't leave the United States because of that. I'm just I'm happy that I don't live in a country that's obsessed with guns, frankly speaking, where everyone runs around shooting everyone. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. So I don't really have a liberal position on this, although I suppose some people might think that because I'm saying, well, I prefer to live in a society without guns, so I guess that is liberal. On the other hand, I'm saying you probably should own a gun in the United States, so I guess that's what, conservative? I don't know. But those are my views. It's all based on context and the history and the culture and the geography of the country, and you can't oversimplify this matter. In the United States, you're not going to get rid of guns, but woe betide the people that try to impose that sort of thing in, I don't know, Denmark. I certainly wouldn't want to see it happen there. As always, thanks for watching, and all of the things I'm referencing will be provided in links in the low bar, a whole bunch of links there. Check it out if you're interested, and I will see you guys the next time. Bye-bye.